Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we looked at the Face Shrine and learned the true nature of Koholint Island. Today, we're examining Eagle's Tower, a great puzzle box style dungeon. But of course, there's a few pre-dungeon things to do. So, let's go ahead and hop right into it. Northeastern peak of the Telltale Mountain Range sits the Eagle's Tower. However, we'll need to find the bird key to gain entry into the dungeon. To do so, we'll need to revive the legendary rooster, meaning we'll first need to learn the frog's Song of Soul. Now that we have the level 2 power bracelet, we can push aside the weather vane in Mabe Village to find the resting place of the rooster, resurrect him, and bring him up the mountains with us. Oh, he made a full recovery? A recovery from being dead? Okay, great. He'll help us fly across these chasms within the mountain cave systems where we can find the bird key. So, in summary, we'll need to learn a song from a frog to revive a bird friend to get the bird key to unlock the bird dungeon. Simple, right? Jokes aside, I do quite like this dungeon lead up. We can actually access this cave ahead of time and catch a glimpse of the key, but otherwise the game allows us to explore and figure out for ourselves where the key is and how we can get it. I like the hands-off approach personally, but maybe that's because it plays into my rather methodical playstyle. We can learn the Frog Song of Soul from Mamu long before this point, for example, so as long as you're thorough, you should be able to figure this out. The only part that I can see being a little too cryptic is knowing that you can push the weather vane aside, but I've always felt like it's made to be enough of a memorable landmark for players personally, since Marin spends a great deal of the game hanging out in front of it, and this guy gives us a hint about it. Luigi! Plus, the remake adds this little sign here to draw a further connection between that hint about the rooster flying and this place. But yeah, I can see this being a little on the cryptic side. Anyways, with all of that said, once we have the bird key, we can unlock the Eagle's Tower. So with the entrance revealed, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome to Eagle's Tower, what is often seen as a very divisive dungeon. Many people don't like this one, citing the confusing layout and overall difficult puzzle box nature as the reason. However, and this may come as no surprise to those keeping up with the series, I love this place. Visually, the dungeon looks great, with a distinct gray-green and blue color palette. It has a colder, less welcoming visual identity than any other dungeon up to this point, though in the Game Boy version, we have the same wall texture that several other dungeons have used already, while the remake gives us a fresh, new stone brick wall texture, which looks fantastic and visually aligns the dungeon interior with its exterior. I can't explain exactly what it is, but in both versions, these blue floor tiles in particular are just super eye-catching and visually appealing as a way to break up the monotony of the usual floor design, as well as draw your attention to certain points of interest. The dungeon music is likewise great. It has this dark, dare I say, spooky vibe, with the levels fading in and out, much as was the case with Face Shrine, but rather than a feeling of questioning and dread, the music here evokes a haunting, dreamlike feeling, like the knowledge Link has that terrible truth is following him through here. It's fantastic and a suitably dark piece of dungeon music. The remake retains this feeling, but naturally swaps out the chiptunes for two types of piano. The main part of this song is done on a standard piano with modulated echoing levels. Then this section kicks in using the same toy piano sound that we heard back in Mabe Village's theme. A dark twist on something familiar? Or is it a familiar twist on something dark? It is interesting to see the progression that these dungeon themes have gone through in tandem with the narrative. Catfish's maw felt dangerous. It was the full extent to how far the lie could be stretched, and it matched that intensity. Between dungeons, we had the twist reveal, and Face Shrine made you stew in it. It let you sit there and question reality, be in denial for a little bit before facing the truth. But now there's no going back. And even though we know the truth, we have to press on, with that knowledge reverberating in the back of our minds, haunting us. While it doesn't quite match how good the Face Shrine theme is, very few tracks will, it is honestly still a great piece of dungeon music. It's just so otherworldly and eerie. As for progressing through the dungeon itself, the tower has a primary objective of using an iron ball to destroy 4 supporting pillars spread out throughout the 2nd floor, which will cause the 4th floor to collapse down into the 3rd. However, doing so isn't as straightforward as it sounds. There are various barriers, gaps, and blocks in the way to make navigation more complex. I love it. The dungeon truly challenges you to learn the layout and engage with its mechanics. You'll often be able to see other parts of rooms that you can't reach and have to throw the iron ball over to, then plot a course and figure out how to get there yourself in order to make progress. The 4 pillars are placed equidistant from each other in the core of floor 2. The eastern 2 are fairly simple to get, since they're placed very close to where we initially find the iron ball, making them a logical starting point. Meanwhile, the western 2 are far more of a task. This one in the northwest requires you to throw the orb over the barrier and then make a trip around the entire outer perimeter of the floor to reach that spot. Meanwhile, the final one in the southwest is placed in a room that you can catch a glimpse of and see that there are bombable walls through this corridor, but you have to make sure first that you've completed this puzzle to make a chest appear so that you can hookshot across the gap. And you've also got to make sure that you've tossed the orb across here first before heading north, bombing the walls so that you can cross through this passageway and break the pillar. I adore multi-step puzzles like this one. Furthermore, Eagle's Tower makes fantastic use of its vertical space, especially for a 2D game, with not just stairways used to connect floors, but also holes in the floor that we can drop down to the corresponding rooms below. And it all makes physical sense in terms of how these rooms are positioned and where you'll end up. And look, there's no underground passageways. Thank you. I know that this dungeon is a real struggle for many, but something about it has always just clicked with me, and I think that aspect of the layout plays a key part in it. The navigation is complicated by design, yes, but it also does make sense if you think about the tower as a physical, largely vertical space, especially with it having no random passageways that will just pop you out wherever, regardless of if it makes sense or not. It just works. The dungeon also heavily incorporates the red and blue gem switches and barriers, adding a further wrinkle into the navigation as certain paths will be blocked off and inaccessible depending on the orientation of those barriers, with the gem switches being deliberately placed in a handful of key locations, allowing you to toggle the colors, which swaps which barriers are raised and lowered. I can't help but admire how well they placed these switches. This one on floor 1 is in a pretty good spot, and toggling the switch is going to impact which parts of the entire floor are accessible, including which staircases you can access to get back up to floor 2. But they do deliberately put a few spaces here to allow you to jump on top of the barriers before toggling it if you need to. That's clever. Meanwhile, upstairs on floor 2, there are 2 more switches. This one right near the item chest stands out a little less and doesn't have quite as many use cases, but the placement of this switch at the south end of floor 2 is a masterful stroke of design, despite only being 2 screens away from the other one. This is a critical room in the dungeon, despite how innocuous it seems. It's right near both the stairway up towards floor 3 as well as the first stairway from floor 1, and since it can be reached and triggered from 3 different directions, in conjunction with the close proximity to the 4 central pillars and how it directly impacts your access to the floor above, it means you're going to be making a pass through this room several times, likely needing to toggle those barriers as you do. It's a small detail, but a critical one when looking at how the progression is handled here. I mentioned this way back when we looked at Bottle Grotto, but a key difference between versions here is that the remake color codes the barriers and switches. In DX, the barriers are all red, while in the remake they changed them to be half red and half blue, which aligns them with how they appeared in A Link to the Past. This sounds pretty minor, and I wouldn't blame you for writing this off as an aesthetic nicety, but I really do feel that the color coding of these barriers makes the puzzle navigation aspect just a little easier to wrap one's brain around. If you can tell which color needs to be raised or lowered, and are able to make a mental note of that, head over to the switch, alter it as needed, and then navigate back. It ties it all together a little more nicely. It's a small but welcome change. A final point to note about the bottom 2 floors is that we'll find the dungeon item here, tucked in a treasure chest that we'll see before we can reach. In the chest, we'll find the mirror shield, and it is my favorite version of the iconic item. A Link to the Past's version simply blocked stronger attacks than before. The 3D versions, meanwhile, mostly got used for light reflecting puzzles. But in Link's Awakening, the mirror shield actually reflects enemy attacks back at them, including spears that moblins throw and even BMOS lasers. This is even more satisfying in the remake, where the BMOS can be petrified, making short work of what is usually an invincible and a very threatening enemy. What a great sense of player progression. As for the dungeon's top 2 floors, there's a little less to note up here since the bulk of the navigation is likely to happen between floors 1 and 2. There's a final gem switch up here on floor 3, which has far more limited use compared to the one down in floor 2. And there is the dungeon's mid-boss, a fella named Grim Creeper. I unfortunately don't have too much to say about this guy. He'll summon these little guys, which are apparently called battle bats, and you've got to make sure to kill them all in one wave. Otherwise, they'll respawn infinitely. In either version, the fight is extremely easy, so long as you position yourself strategically and can mash your sword button quickly enough. Otherwise, once we've wiped out all of his little minions, he will flee and we'll get the nightmare key. From here, if you've already dropped the 4th floor down into the 3rd, then you can pretty well go ahead and finish the dungeon. If not, then you'll have to backtrack downstairs and finish up there first. But either way, once we have dropped floor 4 down and gotten the nightmare key, we can unlock this door and confront the dungeon boss. Rather than a room inside, we'll find ourselves climbing a ladder to the roof of the tower exterior. It's here that we'll see the Grim Creeper again, who mounts this giant bird, initiating the boss fight. This is the Evil Eagle, and like the mid-boss shortly before, he's not exactly going to give you a run for your money. Like Moldorm, this is more about staying in the fight rather than anything else, as he'll do various swoops and aerial attacks, including a wind gust that can knock you down to the platform below. If you do end up falling down, the fight will reset and his health will regenerate. They attempted to make this a little more difficult in the remake by including spikes on the bottom platform, but even then, I don't think this was quite enough to add that element of challenge to the fight. While the gameplay side of things is a little bit lackluster, the fact that the Grim Creeper is the one riding the Evil Eagle does make for a sort of rivalry with them. It's just too bad that in both encounters, they're absolute pushovers. You can fight the eagle with either your sword if you're willing to be patient and wait for them to get close, or with any of the long-distance weapons at your disposal, such as the boomerang. And so long as you're able to withstand the wind and stay in the ring, the Evil Eagle should go down, with dialogue that casts further doubt into the nature of our quest, of course. You will be lost too if the windfish wakes. Same as me, you are in his dream. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and back downstairs we'll find the Organ of Evening Calm, the 7th instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So overall, boss fight aside, Eagle's Tower is a well-designed dungeon that offers just the right amount of challenge for being this late into the game. Many people don't, but I'm a maniac and I love it. The dungeon has a well-conveyed, overarching objective that allows you to make a physical change to the dungeon itself, with these pillars needing to be broken. It incorporates vertical space into its navigation, ties in the gem switches and barriers, and combines all of these concepts into one neatly designed puzzle box dungeon. Any one of these core concepts would be great on their own, but cleverly integrating all of these ideas into one dungeon is just brilliant. A few more notes I have though. Power scaling is always a difficult thing to capture, but you can really feel how much more powerful Link is at this point in the game when you encounter this Hinox, who is technically the strongest version of a Hinox we've encountered to date, but can be destroyed in mere seconds. The enemy variety is pretty good in this dungeon too, even though puzzles and navigation are the main focus over combat here. I am a big fan of these treasure chests that are up on these ledges around the first floor as well, even though only one of them is mandatory, containing a small key, while the other has a secret shell. But it is still neat to play into that verticality that way by requiring us to find the right spot above to jump down to. In a way, the tower is essentially a microcosm, a miniature bit of foreshadowing for the game itself. We'll wreak havoc and destroy an entire part of the dungeon in order to finish it and leave, which mirrors the end of the game, and the dungeon item is a mirror shield. Though this is on a much smaller scale compared to what's to come. It's not the entire place, just 4 pillars to collapse a single floor. Still, knowing how the game ends makes this a bit unnerving to think about. Link is truly a destructive force in this game. Mechanically speaking, while we've seen a lot of instances of these switches and barriers being incorporated into Zelda dungeons, between all of these dungeons in either A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening, this is definitely the most fully realized take on this mechanic, spanning navigation across multiple floors, which requires quite a lot of crisscrossing to get through. It's great. My only real gripe with the dungeon as a whole is that there are some areas that don't quite feel like they were put to use as well as they could have been. For example, these rooms on floor 3 feel a little underdeveloped. pretty well this entire western portion of this floor can be either ignored or entirely circumvented, which is too bad because it presents as if there would be a bit of a navigation puzzle to get through here, but it doesn't really go anywhere with that. If you haven't dropped floor 4 down yet, then it's literally a dead end, and if you have, then you can reach that area by just grabbing the boss key instead and passing through the boss door in the adjacent room, which this connects back on. It feels like something should be there, especially given that there are a fair amount of enemies and a key block, but there just isn't. It might have been worth moving the key block to before the mid-boss instead, and hiding the corresponding small key there, just to make it worthwhile to actually cover this ground. Likewise, I also think that the middle section of floor 1 is a little underutilized. You'll probably have to pass through here once or twice, but it feels more like the area is a red herring, something that looks like a wrinkle in the navigation, but is really there to just throw you off. While my first playthrough of the dungeon doesn't quite stick out in my memory, I can only imagine how much of a headache this area could potentially give to first-time players, only for them to realize that there isn't really much of anything of value here. On repeat playthroughs, if you really know what you're doing, then the entire area can be navigated around by sticking to the surrounding rooms instead, and dropping down around from the floor above. So while minor, it does feel like something of a missed opportunity to not put anything there. Maybe the chest with the compass should have been placed up on this little ledge here, or something. And this is just a teensy tiny little note, but if it were up to me, I would have moved this small key from where it's found here, right beside the corresponding locked door, to this very southwestern room here, just to make slightly better use of this space and the fork in the road that the dungeon initially presents us with. It would make for a very short detour, but I guess I'm just never that big on keys being dropped right in front of a locked door like this. Aside from all of that, however, what we did get with Eagle's Tower is still nothing short of excellent in terms of level design. Of course I'm going to find nitpicks with it while I'm here looking for them, but I promise that even with all of these, it still manages to be among my favorite 2D Zelda dungeons. It is in many ways well crafted, with a fair blend of both linear design as well as non-linear design, since some events like breaking these pillars, getting the mirror shield, or even finding the boss key are able to be done in a variety of sequences. There's elbow room, while still feeling deliberately curated, all the while having several core puzzle navigation mechanics integrated masterfully. Besides, there's just something novel about a dungeon, especially one in a Game Boy game, having such a dynamic element like this one, allowing you to change a core physical part of the dungeon layout itself. That's some good level design. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.